the three major ideologies of the early 20th century, they'll eventually come to fight each other in World War II. So the three major ideologies of the early 20th century that rise really in the wake of World War I will become dominant in Europe, in different places in Europe, and they will literally be government theories that will go against each other in the 1930s and 40s. So it's important to look at the rise of these different ideologies, what they're about, weaknesses that each of them have, and really set up the next step, which is basically World War II. So we'll start with the Russian Revolution and talk about the growth of liberal democracy at the end of the war, the end of the First World War, and then go into the rise of fascism, particularly in Germany. So Russia had gone into the Great War like most of the other major powers that fought the war in August 1914, had declared war against Germany, had launched invasions, and Russia had a pretty miserable military experience in the war, were defeated time after time again, to the point where the Russian homeland was even invaded. And so the Russians are thrown on the defensive, and by the end of 1916, the Russians had lost about 2.5 million soldiers in really just about 2.5 years. So this is a major problem for not just the Russian government, but eventually the Russian people start demanding certain things of their government. The Russian government is a monarchy. It is basically a dictatorship of the king. The king makes the decisions and the army literally enforces them throughout the country. There had been other attempts at revolution against the king going back to the 1800s. They had all failed, obviously. The king was still on the throne. But the outrage over the king's policies and the military failures during the war lead to a new revolution in 1917 that does eventually topple the king. There were a series of strikes that hit in early March 1917, especially the first one, I believe, was on March 8th or so, which is a strike of women who refused to go to work and refused to buy things and whatnot. That leads to a much larger strike amongst the general workforce in Petrograd, or what becomes known as Petrograd. At the time it's called St. Petersburg. That hits on March 10th and literally grinds the whole Russian economy down to a halt. So the Russian government is looking at economic collapse as a result of the strike. And these are some images of literally the Russian people taking to the street with all kinds of different banners demanding different things of the Russian leadership. The Russian king had, even before this, in other instances, had gained control and forced these possible revolutions to end and forced the people to leave the streets by literally sending the army out and ordering the people to disperse, and if they don't, then to disperse them violently with machine guns. The Russian king, his official title is Tsar, and that's how it's spelled in Russian. So his name is Nicholas II. He is the sitting king at the time. And again, he orders the Russian army out to tell the protesters to leave, and if they don't, to shoot into the crowds and force people to leave by brute military force and fear. At this point, though, when the order goes out to the commanders to push the protesters out, and these are massive protests, at least tens of thousands of people throughout the city, many of the commanders refuse to give the order, and oftentimes when the order is given, the individual soldiers with the guns refuse to shoot, because these are often their family members they're going to be shooting at. So at this point, the Russian army splits. And that's always the risk that government leaders take when they order the army to kill their own people. The great question is always, will the soldiers actually follow the order? In this instance, many of the Russian troops not only refused to follow the order, but actively went and joined the protest with their uniforms and with their guns. So now you have a gigantic problem that could threaten civil war, as the troops may start fighting against each other, joined by the people, obviously on one side more than the other. So the attempt at stopping this massive wave of protests and strikes through military force is a complete failure. The Russian Parliament, so this is a kind of a type constitutional monarchy where the king had still most power. So the Russian Parliament was really a kind of rubber stamp for what the king wanted. Really stands up to defend the Russian people. And when the king hears of this, he gives the order to dissolve Parliament. Basically tell the elected politicians to go home. Their services were no longer necessary. At that point, the Parliament also revolts against the king, refuses to dissolve, and in fact passes a resolution claiming to be the leaders of the Russian government and that the king is basically a criminal. At that point, the king seems to understand that he has lost total control of the government, not just the military, but also the kind of day-to-day function of government. And he abdicates, which means willingly leaves the throne, declares that he is no longer king, signs a document giving up his power on March 15th. So literally within 1 week of mass protests, the government falls. The king and his family are sent off to a kind of countryside palace, which is something that often happens in revolutions. Get the king out of town so you can decide what to do next. A provisional government is set up. That provisional government has major problems. It is largely led by democracy types of advocates and a whole lot of kind of liberal constitutionalists, basically a lot of political leaders who say they're going to run a caretaker government until a Russian constitution is written. So they set up a series of elections throughout Russia to take place through the rest of 1917, where the people will be able to elect, hopefully smart, educated people from their own communities, and elected Russian kind of representatives of the people will get together in January 1918 to sit down and formally write a Russian constitution. Delegation of powers, voting rights, and all those kinds of things. So the caretaker government is literally in control, waiting for this constitution to be written starting in January. One of the major mistakes that this caretaker government makes is that it continues the war against Germany, which was an outrage to the Russian people. They wanted the war over in mass numbers. So the provisional government continues the war. The Russian soldiers very often say to their government leaders, we will not invade German territory, we will defend against German attack, we'll defend the Russian homeland against the German invasion, but we will no longer attack. So that's a controversial thing. The government issues a series of pretty bad policy mistakes, to the point where one Russian general mobilizes his army and goes off to invade the capital city to knock out the provisional government and take control, and in his mind set things right. So there's a real threat of civil war here. There's a lot of confusion, and in November, an old revolutionary who had studied Karl Marx and revolutionary theory and had been exiled from the country for supporting revolution in Russia, named Vladimir Lenin, he was exiled to Germany. And the Germans figured that the best way to stop the Russian war is to send this Russian revolutionary back to Russia, maybe you can take down the government and you won't have to fight the Russians anymore. So they literally take this guy, they put him on a train and send him back to Russia. When he gets back, he mobilizes communist intellectuals and ideologues to overthrow even the provisional government, which they do in early November 1917. The problem is that Lenin's communist movement never had mass support of the people in Russia in general. It is a small group. They basically have their own private army, and they invade the government building in the capital city and put the members of the Provisional Government under arrest. They basically throw them in jail, and Lenin and his friend Trotsky largely take control. And they start making major changes. Lenin's group was called the Bolshevik Party. And these are literally the Bolshevik soldiers marching around the government building, defending it against any possible attack. And the Bolshevik Party has many enemies. So in order to defend itself, Lenin orders the government to basically eradicate any dissent, any complaint within Russia itself. Lenin's theory is that the Bolshevik Party represents the desires of the Russian people because the Bolshevik Party is going to bring the Marxist revolution. They're going to wipe out capitalism, build a classless society where no matter what job you have, everybody makes an equal amount of money, everybody is theoretically equal under the law. And Lenin says that this is what the Russian people want, and he's going to enforce it. So, according to Lenin's theory, anyone who would complain about this is probably a capitalist, a greedy person themselves who want to exploit the working class. You know, this old stuff that we talked about Marx in here, right? All this old ideas that Marx had written down, which by this point are decades old, 50 years old by this point. So they've been studied by a lot of people and had excited a lot of people as the possible, future of human freedom in the world. Freedom from economic exploitation in the factory system. So Lenin and Trotsky tried to implement this. The problem is that there's so many different groups that are aligned against the Bolsheviks that when they complain, they get thrown in jail. Sometimes they're just executed. Sometimes people disappear in the middle of the night. This becomes a dangerous thing. So there's a lot of different groups against the Bolsheviks, and number one are the people who supported the Tsar, the royalists. Then there is the rich people of Russia who had made money off of capitalist Russia. They were factory owners and big landowners. There were the Provisional Government supporters, the kind of more liberal, kind of democracy-ish people who wanted to write a Russian constitution. There's a lot of different groups. And then, of course, there's the German invasion. I mean, any one of these groups could take out Lenin's government. So Lenin's government becomes very violent and very paranoid of anyone who complains about what it's doing. But Lenin has a gigantic problem. This group that's been elected by the Russian people before this Bolshevik revolution, this group is getting ready to meet to write a constitution in January, just 2 months after Lenin took power. And Lenin's gigantic problem is that there weren't many Bolsheviks in that group that had won those elections. So Lenin calls his new government the Council of the People's Commissars, which is basically the real representatives of the people. The so-called Constituent Assembly that is going to meet to write the Constitution is set to meet a couple months later. And Lenin has to decide whether or not he is going to allow them to actually write the thing. Remember, Lenin is in control of the government's armies. So he has a military strength where he could destroy this thing if he really wanted to. He decides not to at first. He allows them to meet. And on basically the first day, he shows up and gives a speech at the meeting to the people who will write the Constitution. And he basically says, there's a whole bunch of terrorists in this group. There's a whole bunch of closet capitalists. And I cannot allow you to write a constitution because you're going to write a constitution that favors the rich and really just brings back the old exploitation system. He says the Russian people stand against that. Therefore, I am not going to allow the bourgeoisie to write a constitution that favors the rich. Therefore, you will not be writing a constitution. Does that make sense? Questions about anything so far? And so many people are upset with these statements that Lenin's government inflicts a new wave of political persecutions. And in this step, when he basically sends the Constituent Assembly home, this is where Lenin's government has completely rejected any form of representative democracy, where people have been able to vote for leaders and politicians to carry out the people's agenda. This is turning into a dictatorship very, very fast. And that's the major step. At this point also, the Bolshevik Party changes its name to the Communist Party and outlaws all other political parties. So you cannot be a member of any other party, and you can be arrested for voicing opposition to the Communist Party, because that literally would signify that you want to do something else than the communists want. And because this is so unpopular, as many dictatorships do, they claim the right to revoke people's individual civil rights, your right to free speech or gathering or freedom of the press or anything like that. The government takes the power and officially says, if you are suspected of supporting capitalism or being opposed to the Communist Party or communism in general, then we are going to arrest you, interrogate you, and who knows where that's going to lead. So you don't have the right to a trial, you don't have the right to a speedy trial, you don't have the right to not be tortured and all these kinds of things. So this turns bloody and dangerous and very scary very, very fast. And they obviously put forward a new symbol, which this becomes the symbol of the new Soviet Union. They rename Russia into the Soviet Union, which basically means, or the USSR, it's called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which basically means it's Russia with all those little countries on Russia's border are all brought together into kind of an empire. A large, multinational, multi-state new government, a united government. So it's like a United States of Northern Asia. And their symbol becomes the hammer, the tool of the factory worker, and the sickle, the major tool of the farming, agricultural workers. Okay. And at that point, so many people are still upset with Lenin's government that a gigantic civil war breaks out within Russia itself. And this is where Lenin relocates the Russian government from St. Petersburg into the interior, because the Communist Party does not control nearly all of Russia. They mostly control the western part of Russia, areas centered around Moscow particularly, and they are on attack. They are attacked from all sides. The Germans often still invade, so that's a major problem for Lenin going forward. A peace treaty is announced between Lenin's government and the Germans in early 1918, but sometimes Germans still attack to try to get more land. The Germans, much like the Western Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, do not want to see communism grow up in any country. Even Germany is led by capitalists. And they look to kill communism as fast as possible. So the Germans still invade sometimes to try to kill off communism. The British, the French, and the Americans all send invasions into the communist territories, the communist-held territories, to again try to conspire to kill it. And of course, the royalists, the pro-Tsar forces, are everywhere. They're called the White Armies because white was the kind of official color of the monarchy. So the White Russian forces invade, and the Red Army becomes known as the Communist Army. So this is a multi-dimensional civil war, and it becomes extraordinarily bloody. To make a long story very short, though, eventually the communists will win. One way they won was to eliminate the source of royalist support. Lenin and his leadership eventually figured that the pro-monarchy forces will keep fighting as long as there's a monarchy. So they look to get rid of it. So they issue the order to execute the king and his entire family, including the little children. to completely wipe the family off the face of the earth, and they do that in July 1918. So the theory being that if you knock out the family, then the pro-monarchy forces might just give up. I mean, even if they win the war, who are they going to put back on the throne? They're all dead. And through similar brutal means against the general Russian population that they control, the communists eventually win the war for a whole list of different reasons also. The anti-communist forces are split. There are many. They're coming from many directions. You have pro-royalists, monarchists. You have the liberal Democrats that wanted to write a constitution. You have people who supported the Provisional Government. You have the Germans. You have the Western Allies. And their major problem is that they don't talk to each other about how they're going to attack. They don't coordinate with each other. Because a lot of forces hate each other. The only thing they agree on is that they hate the communists even more. So it's much like the English civil wars, where it kind of devolved down to a 5-way civil war. 4 of them agreed that they all hated the king, but they didn't agree on anything else. And so they had no long-term vision of what they wanted to happen in Russia, even if they won the war. So they're so split that they can never get on the same page on how to win the war in general. Another major thing is that the communist government raises large armies from the general population through drafting. And of course, anyone who resists a draft is probably a capitalist, therefore they can be killed. So this becomes known as the Red Terror against the enemies of the working class. Because theoretically, anyone who speaks out against the communist government is greedy, or they're not for the people if the government supports the people's needs and the people's desires. So if you speak out against the government, you are basically against the people, and you can be eliminated one way or another. Another thing that Lenin's government did was establish something they called war communism, which is basically the levée en masse in Russia. The same idea from the French Revolution. The government takes the power to requisition, to take any private property from any person that might be useful in fighting the war. So if you have a shovel that the government thinks could be useful, they'll take your shovel. If you have extra food from your farm, they'll take it. If you have a gun, they'll definitely take it. And of course, when the army shows up at your house and they say, we need certain things from your house, if you try to resist, you are an enemy of the people and you can be eliminated. So a lot of small-time farmers and shop owners and families are killed by the army just for resisting giving up what they viewed as their private property. And another thing, Lenin appeals to Russian nationalism. He says, look, we're on the side of the Russian people, therefore the invading armies that are attacking us are largely outsiders. And he says that the Russian people should join us in our war against the Americans or the Germans or whoever else. War against the outsiders is a powerful thing, even for dictatorships to use to get mass support. And that still obviously goes on today. It's happening in Syria right now, where the Syrian leader is saying, join me because we're resisting outside incursion, outside invasion. So that's a very common thing that dictators use, or authoritarians use, to keep the population on their side as much as possible. Questions about any of these?
How did the Americans get involved in that?
In what? In the invasions? They largely tried to use the U.S. Navy. Didn't work all that well. It really appears that the American government didn't have its heart set on invading Russia. The American leadership had pressure brought against it by major capitalists in the United States who said, kill communism. So they tried it symbolically, but they did, kill people and destroy things. That's what wars do. But they didn't seem to be really intent on completely toppling its government. They paid much more attention to sending troops to Western Europe to fight this thing, especially to fight against Germany. And after the war was over in Western Europe, the American population generally feels that they want to leave Europe. They don't want to be involved in this anymore. But the civil war in Russia goes on for several years after 1918. Oops. I thought I had a year. I think it goes on until about 1921 or so. Eventually, Lenin's forces prevail. But that doesn't solve the long-term problem of the communist government trying to actually function on a very good basis. The Russian economy was absolutely obliterated during the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War in 1921, 1922, the Russian economy has shrunk to only about 10% of what it was in 1914 when Russia went into World War I. So it has just been entirely destroyed. And a major problem of a communist revolution in Russia is that Russia just didn't have many factories. When you read Karl Marx, he said, you have to start this revolution in an industrialized place, right? Because those places are the ones that will have enough factories to make enough food, enough clothes, and all the kind of stuff that people need to use. The last place that Marx would have wanted a communist revolution is somewhere in Eastern Europe or Russia, basically 1700s economies that are based in farming. So the major economic problems of Russia get even worse in the 1920s. And right at the major moment where the communist forces win the Civil War, Lenin has a series of strokes that basically hospitalizes him and incapacitates him and will eventually kill him within a few years. So Lenin is taken out by ill health. And the leadership of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union in general really falls down to a debate between two major leaders in the party. One is Trotsky, who was with Lenin from the beginning. Another is named Stalin, who had kind of risen through the ranks. He was involved in the revolution from the beginning, but he was more of a politician. He's more of a person who doesn't want to say what he wants to do very much. He just wants to rise to higher levels. He wants to get promoted. Does that make sense? And the best way to get promoted in any kind of power structure is to not take a clear position on anything, right? That way you can claim to be responsible for success and you get to avoid being responsible for failure. Which is exactly what politicians still do today, right? You ever watch these debates or anything, they do as much as possible to avoid taking any kind of clear stance on almost anything. And that was successful for Stalin. Trotsky was very clear in what he wanted to do. He wanted mass industrialization. Trotsky wanted to expand the communist revolution to other countries. And through maneuvering and through political deal-making, eventually Stalin gets Trotsky kicked out of the country. It takes Stalin a few years to get it done. I think Lenin starts having health problems in 1924. So it takes Stalin a good 2 or 3 years to mobilize his own support and to eventually get Trotsky kicked out. But eventually Trotsky is exiled from the Soviet Union, and he goes to Mexico, where he continues to write books and argue, and is still a kind of public intellectual, very obviously a Marxist intellectual. And he basically criticizes Stalin's running of the Soviet Union until he himself is murdered in 1940, very likely at the hands of Soviet agents. Basically, is one day someone shows up and he shoots Trotsky. I think he puts an axe through his forehead and does all 4 different things to Trotsky's body just to make sure he's not going to make it. And that's something that Stalin often did to his opponents. Stalin becomes known as the biggest totalitarian in the world. So Stalin is very paranoid about all the lower levels of leadership, often purges them, not just throwing them in jail, but often just having them disappeared and buried out in some kind of anonymous grave in the middle of the night. So Stalin's government becomes increasingly scary and violent throughout the rest of his time in power. The strange and almost comical thing about Stalin is that immediately when he kicked Trotsky out, he adopted Trotsky's policies, which is another thing that politicians often do. You know, accuse someone else of having bad ideas, and once you defeat them, actually use their ideas because some of them may have actually been good. So the number one thing that Stalin wanted to do was crash industrialization. Stalin basically wanted to fit the entire 1800s industrial revolution that had hit in Britain and do that in about 5 or 10 years in Russia, which is a major government policy. It is going to take a lot of money to build up that level of factories and that change in society. Russia's a backward economy, so Stalin and his leadership figured that the best way to get some very quick money to fund the building of these factories and this kind of new society is to raise a whole bunch of food and then sell it in international markets to get that money. That demanded government control over agriculture. So the next program he launches is called the collectivization of agriculture, which literally means if you have a family farm somewhere that is private property, the government takes it. So all farming in the Soviet Union is government run. It is a communist country, or a communist economy. Many people don't like that. Many people don't like having their family farms taken, and many people try to resist, and many people die in that resistance. Especially out in the Ukraine, which is kind of Western Russia, or Western Soviet Union. A lot of Ukrainians in mass protest stood up and said that they would not allow the Soviet army to take their farms. So Stalin, in response, just refused to have food sent to their area and starved an estimated 10 million people just in order to keep control. So Stalin is historically known as one of the biggest mass murderers in all human history. Much, much worse than Hitler. Of course, Stalin was in power a lot longer than Hitler. And anyone who questions this stuff, even the highest generals and even the highest politicians right underneath Stalin, if you question or if he thinks that you're going to question, you are gotten rid of. And this is Stalin's system of staying in power. And eventually we call it a Stalinist system. It's the deep suspicion of anyone below. And the only way the high leadership stays in office is to every once in a while wipe out the people below and bring in new people. So it is a murderous, oppressive, and fear-based system. Eventually to the point where the Soviet spy network is large and it spies on its own population, really more than anything else. So again, like a lot of other dictatorships, if you're hanging out in a bar or a coffee house and you happen to mention something bad about Stalin or a mistake that the government's making, you may get that knock on your door, or they may not even knock. This is where the government comes to your house in the middle of the night when people are sleeping, and some people are never seen or heard from again. And that's not an exaggeration. That is very real. We call it the police state, which means it is a policed society. They're constantly monitored. People's mail is read if you're on the suspect list. So this is like, today we would think of it as like the government reading your email and listening to your phone calls and following you around when you don't know and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so questions about where the Soviet Union is by the late 1920s and going into the 30s. All right. And remember, that was one thing that Karl Marx talked about. When the first revolution hits, it has to spread. Otherwise, the capitalists of the world will conspire to kill communism at its birth. The capitalists do not want to see communism rise anywhere at any time. And Marx predicted that. And in the aftermath of World War I, when so many Germans were angry at the treaty that they were forced to sign, and other nationalities were angry at what was being done to them, a lot of them tried to implement a communist revolution in their own countries. And it succeeded for a little while in some places, until the capitalist forces literally also marched their forces out into the streets and shot the revolutionaries. And there are European massacres that take place in 1919, 1920. So that's another thing to consider going forward. And that leads us into the next part, what happens to the rest of Europe. The Russians are in revolution and the Communist Party is fighting for its own life and the survival of the Communist Revolution. Much of the rest of Europe is redrawn by the major victors of World War I, Britain, France, and the United States. And they are given what textbooks often call liberal democracy. They're given voting rights, they're given parliaments or congresses, and they get to determine who goes into those buildings to write the laws. They get the right to vote for presidents. So Germany itself will have a parliament elected by the people and elections to determine the German president. So the Versailles Treaty that redrew the map in many places, created a political democracy. There were, I think it's only 3 democracies that existed in Europe when World War I began. And there were 18 afterward. So they literally go in and rebuild the politics of the countries that were defeated and much of Eastern Europe also. But they don't just create a political democracy. They go in and rebuild capitalism in those places. So you have political democracies combined with capitalist economies, and the theory coming out of the West was you will get political stability through voting rights, and you will get economic prosperity through capitalism. The people will be happy. You won't get any more wars. And also, especially in the United States foreign policy, the United States leaders did not want to have a military alliance with any of these countries. Britain and France wanted a long-term military alliance with the U.S. because they thought that was the one source of military stability for Europe as a whole. But the Americans pulled out. And eventually the U.S. Senate does not ratify the Versailles Treaty. So the United States doesn't even become a part of the League of Nations. The United States foreign policy in the 1920s is to basically not use military power to keep the European order stable, but to use economic power. They called it dollar diplomacy. Basically, they threatened any European government with economic destruction if any of these governments start getting out of line. And that creates a new wave of problems. Remember, Germany had to be declared guilty of starting the war. Therefore, they had to make these repayments, these reparations payments on a monthly basis, especially to Britain and France. And even in the early 1920s, the German government just can't make those payments. The payments are too big. The German economy is trying to recover, and now they're sending a lot of money to foreign places, which doesn't really benefit the German economy at all. It's just sucking money out of the system. The German, now democratic leadership, the elected leadership, decides that the best way to pay off those debts is to just print a whole bunch of money on paper. You know, if you owe someone $10,000, why not just get some nice pieces of paper and write $10,000 notes on it and just hand it over and say, here you go, have fun. That was a theory that the German government ran, so they printed a huge amount of paper money and started sending it to Paris and London as repayment. But what happens when you print a whole bunch of money real fast? You get inflation. And in the German instance, They didn't just get inflation, they got what we call hyperinflation. Their currency is destabilized to the point where people have trouble buying daily items. So if you are a German worker and you have a family to feed, if you have a job that pays you, $50 a week, you can feed your family if you go to the store on Monday and bread costs, $5 a loaf, right? You have enough money to pay it. But with hyperinflation, you go to the store on Monday, you buy it for $5 a loaf, come back the next week, it's $20. Come back the next week, it's $100. Come back the next week, it's $2,000. That is the literal inflation rate that Germany had. So within a matter of weeks, your wages don't rise that fast, right? Your boss is not going to give you that kind of raise that quick. So a lot of German families went hungry because they just didn't have enough money to buy the daily necessities to survive. And at that point, the Germans remember that this treaty system is the cause of it all. Germany had not been invaded during the war, so why did they give up? Why did they sign this thing? The German people become hugely angry at their own government leaders, and when the next election rolls around, they look to kick those leaders out of office and bring in someone else who has different ideas for how to run the economy and solve the problem. So you get the rise of extremist parties, and particularly the National Socialist Party, that called itself the Nazi Party for short. And they became an increasingly popular party because the leader of their party, Adolf Hitler, promised to fix the economic catastrophe. And this is in the 1920s, before the Great Depression hits. So this is an unstable system for Germany. The United States is growing economically at massive rates. So the U.S. foreign policy is, they try to give a loan to the German government to give them cash so that the Germans can take that cash and pay the British and French. And since the British and French governments owe a lot of that money to American companies still from the war, the American theory is that's just going to cycle back to American companies, so what's the big deal? So they devise systems of new loans throughout the 20s to try to keep the German economy afloat somehow. And that ability goes away. Starting in 1929. The U.S. Wall Street crash, the stock market crash, hits in late 29. And you get a system of economic downturn that becomes very, very dangerous. Not just in the United States, but the U.S. government will start to cut its budgets, which means they don't want to give loans to the German government anymore, which means the German government doesn't have a leg to stand on anymore. So the U.S. stock market crash has not just destroyed the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy was the biggest in the world at that point, so it drags most of the rest of the world economy down with it, just like it did in 2007, 2008, and still is today, in a lot of ways. So the effect for this is obviously been studied in the U.S. and should have been taught a lot of that stuff in high school, but the effect for Europe is even worse. Some basic statistics on the initial crash itself. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is a group of, I think it's like 30 companies, and the 30 most valuable and stable companies in the United States. Today, companies like Microsoft and DuPont are on there. They are seen as the most stable, least risky investment. So the health of the overall stock market is often measured by the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That's why you often hear on the news the Dow dropped a certain amount. This is the group of companies they're talking about. So in this 1 month, you get a 40% drop in the value. And very quickly afterward, U.S. trade, U.S. international trade drops also 40%. So what do these companies do? Number one, who runs these companies?
Capitalists?
Who?
Capitalists?
Well, capitalists, but in general, who has the power that makes decisions at these companies?
Government?
Not government. These are privately owned companies. Huh?
Rich people?
Yeah, rich people, investment people. The big stock owners of companies. And if you own stock in a company, what's the number one thing you want?
A lot of it.
Well, a lot of it, but you want the stock to remain at high value, right? When the stock's value starts to go down, the leaders of these companies start saying, holy crap, my investment is shrinking. So in order to stop that fall and try to rebuild the value, they start cutting their company's budget to stop the losses, to stop the money losses, right? What do they do to cut budgets? They lay off thousands and thousands of workers. Now, much of the workforce doesn't have the cash on hand to spend because they're not making their hourly wages anymore, so they stop buying stuff, or they don't buy as much stuff as they did. So they're not buying as many cars or radios or tables or whatever. The radio making companies, the car making companies see their profits drop because they're not selling as much, and what do? They lay off more workers. And that's where you get into this kind of toilet bowl of water going down, and there's no end in sight. And that's why it gets worse and worse and worse for several years. And that's the eventual system that creates the Great Depression. The initial stock drop does not immediately cause the depression. The depth of the depression does not hit until 1932-33. And fascism is a fascinating thing to study. Largely because much of Europe had been forced to accept democracy at the end of World War I as a demand of the winning countries, most notably the United States in 1919. They split up the old European monarchies and built up these new nation states and gave the people voting rights so that they would elect their own governors and their own presidents and their own parliaments and congressmen and whatnot. And the leaders of that movement believed that, just as many democracy supporters do today, that people hate war. Populations generally don't want to fight wars. So that would prohibit and slow down the European movement toward future conflicts. Because any politician gets into office, if he promised to go to war or if he took the country to war, then he'd be voted out of office fairly quickly. So they build democracies in places that hadn't really had them yet for a long time. It's estimated, I believe the numbers are, before World War I there were 3 democratic republics in Europe, and in 1919, just a few years later, there were 18. So we have 15 new countries, 15 new societies that have experience with democracy that had been living under authoritarian monarchies beforehand. So the experience of democracy for a lot of people is brand new. And especially in places like Germany, democracy doesn't really gain a very good reputation for itself, because Germany immediately goes into these financial problems as a result of the reparations payments. And there, in Germany and other places, large groups start to rise up and complain about democracy and its failures. And they look to replace it with the new system. That system that many of them will decide on eventually will be called fascism. The term fascism, it comes from the old Roman Empire, where they had these kind of stern, literally, images of faces that gave a kind of warning to the people to stay in line or else the government would deal with them. So fascism literally means a return to kind of authoritarianism, the strong leader in the government that knows what's right, and anyone who complains can be dealt with in a sometimes pretty brutal way. So that's what the term actually means. But first to go through the failures of what historians would call liberal parliamentarism, which basically means democracy, the democracy of Congresses and representation and whatnot. When it was put into place in Europe, the constructors, the builders of democracy in Europe, had certain things that they wanted to make sure were put into place. So number one is saying that the law is most important, and that's what generally republics are. That's what a republic is supposed to be. A place where everybody is equal under the law, no matter how rich you are, no matter how poor you are, no matter if you're the president of the country or just the lowliest of citizens. Everyone has to follow the law. The law should be blind in who's being charged and whatnot. It should just enforce the law equally amongst everybody. That often conflicts with politics, because oftentimes politicians say that they need to break the law when there's a political emergency. They need to make changes. They can't wait for the law to be enforced to deal with a political crisis for the nation. Does that make sense? So the Democrats come in and they literally say the law is all important. This excuse to allow the governors of a country to break the law, that is monarchy. That is saying that this one person, this one group is above the law better than everyone else. That is unequal and therefore should be gotten rid of. So these Democrats come in, they write constitutional parliaments, congresses, and governing bodies, legal bodies, whose number one goal, number one job is to protect the citizens under the law and deal with political problems on the secondary level. Does that make sense? Okay, that's going to run into big problems. Really, the biggest thing that the fascists say is that in a crisis, you have to put the needs of politics, the needs of the government, above the rule of law. The ability to deal with the crisis should be more important than guaranteeing the people's equality under the law. That is the fascist theory. So at this point, political needs are now far, far more important in the fascist mind than things like civil rights or your right to not be arrested and tortured or something like that. They'll say if there's a crisis, it may get ugly, but we got to do what we got to do in order to save the country, save the government. So that one, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? They're just flipping the relationship between law and politics. One of the next major problems with democracy as it comes to be in Europe is that they have these representative parliaments which in the face of a crisis don't often work very well. Because when a crisis hits, and we've seen this in the United States, in the American democracy, when a crisis hits the United States, does Congress immediately take action to do something about it? No. What do they do instead?
Argue about it.
Yeah, they argue about what to do. And sometimes they don't even start doing that very fast. They want to look around and find who's an expert on this topic. Let's bring together a whole bunch of experts and have them come up with a series of proposals that the government could enact. So that alone could take a while. Get the experts together, have them drop a list of things to do, or possibilities. And then they're going to send it to a committee to study all those possibilities and get a recommendation from a government committee. And then maybe you're going to have a wide debate in all of Congress, on the floor of Congress, where each politician stand up and talk about what they think is the best thing to do. And then maybe we'll have a vote at some time in the future. So maybe a year or two from when the crisis starts, Congress will actually do something. You ever heard the joke that if progress means moving forward, if pro means moving forward is good and progress is attached to that, then what does Congress mean? Yeah. If pro is the opposite of con, then progress must be the opposite of Congress, basically. And it's a very true statement. Because within democracy, democracies are slow to take action. Because they want to hear different individual opinions and then take their time to make the best choice. And that often works, but doesn't always work when you have an immediate crisis that has to be dealt with, like a stock market crash, or a possibility of a Great Depression, or an invasion. Sometimes it's not the best idea to sit around and debate this stuff for half a year. So a lot of Europeans started complaining about that, particularly in the mid to late 20s, and particularly in Germany, when the German economy really starts to go down. they very clearly say that parliamentarism fails in a crisis. They take too long to debate and form committees and finally take a vote. By the time they actually take a vote to find the best choice, sometimes the crisis is either blown up to the point where it's possibly destroyed the nation, or the crisis has become unmanageable somehow. So fascists will say, we need a government that can make immediate, fast decisions. We don't want to sit around and have these debates for month after month after month while the crisis gets worse and worse and worse. We need somebody in authority somewhere in the government that can deal with the crisis on an immediate basis. And often those leaders will act on their own intuition because they're not going to spend the time to study every single possibility. They're going to get a short list. They're going to make a fast decision to deal with the crisis. And fascists say that works better because you will get an answer quickly, rather than sitting around that debates could take months or even years sometimes to come up with some kind of solution. So fascism is inherently authoritarian. They want to promote some kind of dictator or leader, or some will call him a king, or even some will call themselves presidents. But if you look at the source of their power and their ability to overcome things that are pretty, that a lot of people that support democracy are afraid of, like giving this one group or this one person too much power to make instant decisions about anything. That can turn bad pretty fast, right? It completely relies on the trustworthiness of the leader. You get someone up at the top of the government pyramid running the whole system, and they seem much more interested in staying in power than actually doing anything good for the people. That can get very ugly. And that's where you end up with people like Stalin, or modern-day Saddam Hussein, or something like that. Okay, that one makes sense. All right. Another major problem for parliamentary democracies, and often for governments even still today, is that this is a politics of the majority, of the people, because the people are getting the voting power. Therefore, politicians have to go forth and advertise themselves to the average working kind of people that are the mass majority of voters. And you see this in American elections too, where you get these very, very wealthy candidates. They get rid of their suit and tie and they put on some kind of miner's jacket or something, and they try to pass themselves off as the average working person, even though most of them are millionaires by now. And it's very transparent. It's very obvious to most of us when we watch it. They don't really care about traveling through this particular town, other than it might get them votes. They carve their image out. They create an image for themselves that is often very different from what they really are. But politicians have to do that to get votes. And they have to make promises to the average working people to get their vote. But when they get into office, a lot of things they promise, especially in the early 1900s, land reform, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, that are now coming out of feudalism slowly. They're promising land redistribution. Today in the United States, they mostly talk about middle-class taxes. They make those promises when they're running for office, and if they get elected, they go into office, and very quickly they start saying different things, right? Because the people who bankroll their campaigns, who really have pressure against them, start bringing more pressure than the mass voters can. So the inherent economic elite, the rich people of given countries in democracies, when they're allowed to give money to campaigns, they rule. So you get a difference between what politicians say, then the pressure comes in from the rich, and then they do different things because they need that money to run for re-election. And that was a problem even in the first democracies in Europe in the early 1900s, first modern democracies at least. They had politicians that promised certain things, and they got into office and sometimes did the exact opposite. And people are angry. And people still are angry about that stuff, right? But that's a natural result of just the kind of political structures you build. If you allow your candidates to take money, millions and millions of dollars from the rich. They're going to respond to the people who give them money. And that's the way it works. Does anyone know how much money was spent in the 2012 elections for Congress and President? $2 billion for the presidency. At least $2 billion. It's closer to 2.2, but including Congress and the presidency, over $6 billion. Billion with a B. That's $6,000 million. Put it that way. And the vast majority of it comes from very wealthy people who are billionaires themselves. So, you're giving $5 to a candidate. Maybe they'll send you an email or something, but they're probably not going to listen to you as much as they're going to listen to someone who gives them $10 million. Right? That's where the pressure comes from. So you get a difference between the politicians have to go into the public and make all these promises to the people and learn how to be popular politicians, and when they get into office, they often listen to the winners of the economic race who don't want to see the rules of the game changed. So questions about any of these at all? So again, pretty theoretical, but if you can kind of break it down into real-world examples, it becomes much easier to understand. So the parliamentary politicians, the Democrats, had a difficult time getting the mass majority support because the mass majority understood that they're being lied to. So in democracy, it's often difficult for the politicians to go to the people and make promises and then fulfill them. Under fascism, though, it's fairly easy. The leading politicians can go to the people. They have these giant rallies, and the Nazi Party in Germany was famous for that. They'd have giant rallies in football stadiums, tens and tens of thousands of people. And it's all organized by the party and run by the government. So fascist leaders often find it fairly easy, and they become some of the very early users of the idea of mob psychology. Get people in big groups and get them excited, get them kind of to a frenzy, and when you put the leader on stage, they go wild, and it looks like this person has the support of the mass majority of people in the whole country. So fascism, especially in Germany, will actually rely on the mobilization of the masses. They often don't get so much of a vote in determining who the leader is, but you see the mass support being staged by the party. And that was much easier under this kind of fascist, totalitarian, authoritarian system than under democracy, where you have a lot of different politicians competing for the same audience. And a lot of the fascists and even the Nazi leadership, Nazis, that term comes from the National Socialist Party. And they were a socialist party. They took government revenue to build up what has become known as the welfare state. They had universal health care coverage run by the government. And that goes far back into Germany, all the way back to Bismarck. They had universal education. They had worker compensation laws. I mean, they had a lot of things that other countries just didn't have at the time. So they were very much socialist. They were taking government revenue to put systems in place for the public good. And it's very easy to prove. And the Nazis advertised themselves this way. And if you look at Nazi political posters, it's very, very clear that they advertise themselves based as the kind of guarantor, or the protector of families. And the eagle in the back is often a Nazi party symbol. And you get, on the right side, the workers and the kind of impoverished people of society going to complain to the Nazi authority. And, he looks like a big, strong, stern kind of guy, but he's there to protect them. So he's not there to really threaten them, hopefully. But one of the trade-offs in this kind of system, when you advance a leadership group to that level where they have that much political control, the Nazis did other things with that power, right? They don't just give you health care, they also give you advice on how to raise your children, which started to turn pretty scary. They give you advice on who to marry based on genetics. And that's where you obviously start getting the blonde-haired, blue-eyed kind of interpretation that these people are like the supreme greatest white people ever to live. And everyone else is just kind of lower up on the ladder. And you obviously get that in the poster on the right also. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, big, strong guy. So the authority could do kind of suggestive and even destructive things to society with that kind of power. It's a trade-off. You take your chances. Do you want stability, or do you want these kind of mass democratic politics that got sloppy, got messy every once in a while? And when you vote for stability, you take your risk with who you're putting in power. So questions about this stuff at all? No. You guys are alive. Okay. I hope so. Another thing, especially as we go more toward defining the Nazi Party as the kind of prototypical fascist movement, there are other fascist movements, specifically in Italy, that grow powerful even before the Nazis come to power in Germany. But the Nazis have become, to historians, the most symbolic government of fascism. They're the ones who took it to the deepest extreme. So in getting rid of the democratic parliamentary demand for equality in society, the fascists say that the need of the nation is supreme. So they start defining the nation, the group, the country, as the highest level of not just kind of importance, but symbolically, people should dedicate their lives to the nation. And that was a kind of cult that the Nazis also defined, because when they start talking about the nation, they're mostly talking about the Nazi leadership. So if you are a good German, you're not really concerned with your own individual greedy interests. You're concerned with the German race surviving and doing well. And oftentimes there are calls to individual people to sacrifice themselves for the good of the nation. So oftentimes, especially with the Nazis, they define the nation as a kind of racial entity as they get further and further into these descriptions of different kinds of even German races. And they believe that the German race was best, and that the blonde-haired, blue-eyed northern German Aryans were the absolute best of all the Germans. So they get into these real strict definitions of how different looking peoples with different heritage, different ethnicities relate to each other, or how they should relate to each other, at least in the Nazi mind. And you start getting laws passed that a pure-blooded Aryan, and they define that in a lot of different ways. Your great-great-grandparents have to be Aryans all down through your family, and you have to prove it genealogically. Those kinds of people are only allowed to marry other Aryans because they want more good Aryan babies. They don't want intermixed races having children. So they start getting this idea of purity, especially of what they view as the highest level race, which in itself is pretty restrictive, right? It's pretty oppressive of people's individual choice. And they're saying that because your individual desires are not as important as the survival of the German race. And if the Aryans, in their mind, don't survive, if the Aryans just kind of get interbred with the weaker races, then the German race in general will get weaker and maybe conquered and split apart at some point. Question?
Yeah, I was wondering, in regards to that, Hitler, I've heard rumors, was partially Jewish or something. How come his racial heritage didn't factor into all this?
There's a lot of stuff written on attempts, I'll put it that way, of understanding Hitler's psychology and why he would have come to these kinds of understandings. Because he wasn't pure German. He was half Austrian. I believe it was his mother's family that was attached to certain Jewish groups. He didn't have blonde hair, right? He was a short guy. So he wasn't the gigantic, 6.5 foot tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed muscle guy. Why would he have defined the perfection to be not what he was? There's a lot of accusations that he hates his mother, and, possibly gay. I mean, you get all these kinds of different things. he's such a self-hating kind of person that everything that he was, he attacked in others. There's tons of stuff written on that, and personally, I don't find a whole lot of value in it, because how can you prove it? How are you going to prove that Hitler hated his mother? But Hitler appeared to be very antisocial. Kept to himself, became obsessed with his own ideas, especially about race and how the Germans fit into the world and how they're going to conquer the world and preserve the world as it should be. One interesting thing is he was an art student. So he... No? Oh, okay. He was an art student. He was a soldier in World War I. And he was enraged when the Germans surrendered. So after the war, he went to study art. I think it was in Vienna. And was rejected by all the art schools. He submitted drawings as a portfolio and never got accepted anywhere. So he hated artists also eventually too. But he had a real problem drawing people. And eventually the drawings that he becomes most famous for are drawings of cities. And he has these grand visions of these giant buildings, like these Gothic-looking buildings and stuff. But when you look at a lot of his drawings of all these different buildings that he wanted to build this perfect city, there's never people. There's no people walking around. He seems to have that in his mind. And it's a difficult thing to explain or understand, but that's who he was. And it takes a special kind of person to get to that level, right? To hide in a bunker for day after day after day and not talk to anybody, and it's a scary thing when you put someone like that in government power, and he's the one who gets to decide on war and peace and what laws get passed and all that. But he's the one who leads a lot of this criticism. So he's a very famous German politician even before he gets into power. But why does Hitler attack who he is? I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, and when I read those kind of histories of Hitler's personality, they just don't bring a whole lot of evidence. I don't think it's reliable enough.
Speculation.
All kinds of, Abraham Lincoln was gay. They have like the series of all these famous politicians that must have been gay for one reason or another, right? Or psychotic, or OCD is one of the new ones too. Yeah. There's even an accusation that Thomas Jefferson was autistic. Yeah. So there's all that kind of stuff out there. I don't read a whole lot of it. I find some of it kind of funny, but it's not as ridiculous as saying Abraham Lincoln fought vampires. It has that going for it. Okay, other questions about this stuff? All right. Okay, and since especially the Nazis in Germany defined the nation in a certain way as this kind of community of the greatest race, Hitler and the Nazis become advocates of protecting the race somehow. And remember, Germany had been split. Land had been taken from Germany after World War I. They didn't just take land. People are living in that land. So the German nation was split in Hitler's mind after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles. It split the German people off into several different countries. So Hitler believes that in order for the Germans to really defend themselves in this kind of battle of the international races, you have to at least get all the Germans back in the same place again. So according to his racial ideas and his obsession with protecting the German race as a kind of community in and of itself, he has to bring them all back together, which by default automatically means Hitler wants to take all that land back that was taken away from it after World War I, which means, logically, Hitler's foreign policy will be to destroy the Versailles Treaty. And destroying the Versailles Treaty could have long-term effects, especially for democracy in Europe. He just doesn't want to destroy it to get the Germans back in. Eventually he wants to destroy it because he doesn't like democracy. He's a fascist. He's an authoritarian. He thinks that is the wave of the future. And a lot of people believe him. He makes those arguments in the mid to late 20s, had a fairly large following, tried to overthrow the German government at Munich in something like 1924 or so, and build a fascist government. That didn't work. He got arrested and thrown in jail for a while. and strangely was let out far ahead of his original release date, because he promised not to cause any more problems. But his definition of the German race as needing this kind of defense, bring the German people back together, automatically down the line leads to kill the Versailles Treaty. And one of the major problems, especially the Western Europeans, the British, the French, and the Americans, is that they don't see the ramifications of his racial philosophy. They don't put that they don't see far down the road. They don't put those steps together until it's too late. Once Hitler got into power and started operating the German government according to these principles, the French and the British should have started building their militaries quickly, because this is the logical result. They don't, and they suffer the consequences for it eventually. When Hitler gets out of jail, somewhere around, I think, 1927 or so, he starts building the Nazi Party again. Not through revolution, but through voting. And at first, the Nazi Party is not very popular. They get maybe 5 or 6% of the vote in German elections. But then the stock market crash hits. The German economy is already doing badly. Was propped up by the U.S. economy, all those loans. So when the U.S. economy goes completely into the tank in the early 30s, there's no support for the German economy anymore, and the German economy falls even worse. And you can see the direct result of this in the German elections, especially the election of 1932. As unemployment in Germany rose steadily after the rise or the growth of the kind of financial international calamity started by the U.S. stock market crash, the Nazi vote percentage goes up with it. Why is that? Because people are unemployed, they can't afford to feed their families, they're mad. And they're mad at the Democrats, at the people who supported democracy. They say democracy doesn't work, look at what it's given us. So they start voting for extremist parties who have different solutions. And the Nazi Party is the big winner in that race. Hitler himself ran for president of Germany in 1932 and lost. He was crushed by the sitting president. But the Nazis got up around 40% of the vote. So they go into the lawmaking body, the German parliament called the Reichstag. And because they were a newly emerging party, the advisors to the president said Hitler hadn't won any election ever, personally, but he's the leader of this party that's rising. So the advisors to the president said, give him an office in the presidential administration so that he has some claim to power, some claim to this new rising party now has influence. But if you give him a lower level position, you can control him. And if he's a member of the government, he can no longer really attack, right? He has to help run the country. So they appoint him German Chancellor the next year after the elections. So he becomes German Chancellor in January of 1933. The Chancellor is very much, well, not very much, but kind of like the U.S. Secretary of Defense. It's a type of military leadership position on military strategy and what the Army should be doing, that kind of stuff. And again, he never himself won an election, but his rise to power is democratic. So this would be like if the Republican Party got a whole bunch of the vote in the last election. So you take the chairman of the Republican Party, if any of you even know who that is, and give him a position in Obama's cabinet. Make him Secretary of the Treasury or something like that. Secretary of Transportation. And with Obama replacing so many of his administrators, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, he may bring in a Republican, right? He did it last time when he won in 2008. There was a Republican Secretary of Defense until, I think, about a year ago. So this stuff is pretty common in these types of coalition governments. And Hitler was the benefactor of this. So he becomes chancellor underneath the authority of the president. The president is above him, the president's making the final decisions. So he has an office. Hitler has an office in the administration. So questions about that at all? All right, the interesting thing to note is that a lot of people, and especially like the History Channel, likes to believe that the Nazis came to power through brute force. They took over the government. No, they were elected. The German voters chose fascism, a little less than half of them, because they're so upset with democracy and its failures. And that's something that a lot of people forget, and it's a dangerous thing to forget, right? So, think about who and what you're voting for, if and when you vote.